think it was Samuel Huntington, who said that although we tend to forget it in the West, the rest of the world does not forget that our values were spread by force of arms rather than force of argument. We can very easily fall into the delusion of thinking that the rest of the world came to liberal democracy because of its obvious and intrinsic superiority. But as a matter of historical record, that is not how it happened. And it turns out that these values of ours, liberty under the law, open societies, have a much shallower hold on large swathes of our planet than we would have thought possible until very recently. We saw it first in the lineup over the Russia-Ukraine conflict. To us, it may have seemed perfectly obvious that a country had been attacked without provocation by a neighbour that had promised to defend it, that a democracy, however imperfect, was invaded by an autocracy. That is not how it looked in a number of other places. And we see that same division, perhaps even more starkly, in the reaction to the crisis in Israel and Gaza. Indeed, in a lot of the global south, people put the two things together and accuse us, by which I mean the West at its widest, of stunning double standards. You'll have all heard this from colleagues in other countries. I certainly have. They'll say things like, how would you feel if Putin had ordered Ukrainian civilians to clear out of half of Ukraine? Or how would you feel if Russia had bombed 2 Polish airports in the way that Israel preemptively bombed 2 Syrian ones? Or how would you react if Russia cut off Ukrainian energy? Well, actually, they say, we know how you reacted to that. You called it a war crime and called for trials. Now, we may have what we think are good answers to those things. We may point out that in both cases, a fundamentally open and law-based society is at war with a fundamentally terrorist state, a state that has no rule of law and is actuated only by force. We might point out that there is a huge difference between the unprovoked attack on Ukraine and Israel responding to the abominations of the 7th of October. But from the perspective of the rest of the world, all of that looks like Western realpolitik dressed up in the language of moralizing. And I'm afraid we've been brutally reminded of how short is the reach of our values. We talk about universal rights. The noble Lord Coker spoke very movingly in opening of his uncle, in his belief that in fighting in 1944 he was making the world safer for democracy. And actually for the next 70 or so years it would have seemed a reasonable thing to have assumed that that had happened. We saw the rule of law and open society spreading roughly until what the noble Lady Baroness Smith described as the significant year of 2011, when that process stalled and began to go into reverse. We are reminded of Samuel Huntington's truth, that what we call universal values in reality became universal values because of a series of military victories by the English-speaking peoples and their allies. Imagine that the Second World War had ended differently. Imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There'd have been nothing universal about them then. And that's why it matters that we are still prepared to defend our values with proportionate force, above all in Ukraine. There is a road to victory in Ukraine. You can imagine the Ukrainians breaking through to the Sea of Azov, kettling the Russian garrison in Crimea and having peace. But if Russia succeeds, if Russia can wait this out, maybe get a friendlier regime in Washington, D.C., then the West collectively will have suffered a loss of prestige that makes Suez look like a picnic. In every other continent and archipelago, people will recalibrate whom they need to listen to. That noise you hear, my lords, that is the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of Western liberty.